The room was too cold for paper that old. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat, indifferent glow across rows of gray archive boxes that hadn't been opened in decades. Dust hung suspended in the air, unmoving, as if even time itself had slowed out of respect for what was buried here. In October of 2003, a civilian researcher named Daniel Mercer sat alone at a metal table inside the National Archives Annex in Maryland, turning pages that had outlived the men who wrote them. He wasn't looking for ghosts. He was looking for logistics, unit rotations, supply chains, routine after-action summaries from the Vietnam War, the kind of administrative debris no one thought twice about. But then he found the page that wasn't a page anymore. It was an absence. The folder was labeled with the sterile precision of military bureaucracy. Operation Reports, 1968, Riverine Sector. Contained, orderly, forgettable. Until Mercer reached the final sheet. He stopped breathing for a moment without realizing it. The paper was intact, but the content was gone. A thick, deliberate blackness covered nearly the entire surface. Not faded ink. No damage. Intentional redaction. Heavy. Absolute. Except for 3 words left untouched at the center, like coordinates. River. Night. 0 survivors. Mercer leaned closer, the metal chair creaking softly beneath him. The words didn't explain anything. They made it worse. 0 survivors. Not casualties. Not losses. 0 survivors. The phrase carried a finality that military language usually avoided. It wasn't tactical. It was terminal. He ran his fingers lightly along the edge of the page. The paper was different from the others. Slightly rougher. Older, maybe. Or handled more often. Handled and then buried. The archive room was silent except for the faint electrical buzz overhead and the distant echo of a closing door somewhere down the corridor. Mercer felt something he couldn't quite name. Not excitement, not yet. Unease. Because reports like this weren't supposed to exist. Every operation had a designation, a command structure, an outcome. Even failures had explanations, especially failures. But this had been erased. Not lost. Erased. He flipped back through the folder, searching for references. There were patrol summaries, equipment inventories, casualty lists with names and dates and coordinates, lives reduced to typed lines. And then nothing. No lead-in, no follow-up. Just the black page. River. Night. 0 survivors. He wrote the words down in his notebook, pressing harder than necessary, as if afraid they might disappear again. What kind of mission gets erased from military history, and who decides a river crossing never happened? The answer wasn't in that room. Not yet. But the river had a name. It surfaced weeks later in a separate file, buried under a different designation. A radiolog transcript, partially degraded, its edges curled and yellowed with age. Mercer found it by accident, chasing a reference code that didn't quite match. He recognized the date immediately. August 1968. The transmission was fragmented, static scarred. Approaching the West Bank. Negative visual on extraction. Repeat, negative, and then a gap, followed by a final entry. They're still moving forward. No unit identifier, no coordinates, just silence after that. Mercer stared at the page, imagining the voice on the other end of that transmission. Young, probably. Focused, trained to compress fear into procedure. Still moving forward. Forward into what? The official history said nothing about a failed crossing that night. No mention of a lost platoon. No commendations. No reprimands. It was as if the men who stepped into that river had stepped out of history itself. But rivers don't forget. In Vietnam, rivers were everything. They were highways, borders, lifelines, and sometimes they were graves. By 1968, the war had become a maze of waterways and shadows. Movement happened at night because daylight made you visible, predictable, vulnerable. Night gave you concealment, and it gave the enemy the same gift. Somewhere along one of those rivers, under a moon that illuminated nothing and everything at once, a unit had crossed. Unauthorized, unrecorded, and according to the only surviving line of their report, none of them came back. Mercer began to understand that he wasn't looking at a missing page. He was looking at a decision. Someone had decided this mission would not exist. Not publicly, not officially, but decisions like that leave fingerprints. field notes that don't match the official timeline, radio operators who remember voices they were told to forget, survivors who weren't supposed to survive, because there are always survivors, even when the report says otherwise. Mercer closed the folder carefully, the blacked-out page lingering in his mind like an afterimage burned into the retina. River, night, 0 survivors. 3 words that concealed a story someone had gone to great lengths to silence. But silence, he would learn, is never empty. It waits. And eventually, someone listens. They say he never raised his voice. In a war that swallowed names whole, he barely existed to begin with. No official portrait, no framed photograph in academy halls, no medal citation written in polished language for public display. His name appears only in the margins of operations logs, typed once, misspelled twice, and then abbreviated to an initial. After the war, there was no lecture circuit, no memoir, no retirement ceremony with polished brass and folded flags, just a gap where a man should have been. And yet the soldiers remembered him. Sergeant Callahan remembered the way the commander stood outside his canvas tent during the monsoon, rain flattening the earth around his boots. The humidity clung to everything: that seasoned fabric, skin, breath. The air smelled of wet canvas and gun oil, of damped maps and rusting ammunition crates. Inside the tent, lantern light flickered against mud-streaked faces. Outside, he would stand without cover, collar unbuttoned, sleeves rolled precisely once. He never fidgeted, he never paced. He watched the river in the distance as if it were speaking. Callahan used to say that was the first unsettling thing. The commander didn't seem to look at terrain the way other officers did. He didn't measure it in gradients and firing arcs. He measured it in inevitabilities. Lieutenant Arjun Mehta, the intelligence officer assigned to the battalion, distrusted him from the beginning. Mehta believed in paperwork, in approved channels, in reconnaissance cycles that built toward consensus. He had seen the requests come through headquarters 3 times. The crossing operation, same coordinates, same objective, seize the opposite bank before enemy reinforcements consolidated. Twice the response came back stamped in red: insufficient artillery support, unacceptable casualty projection, risk of overextension beyond supply corridor, denied. The third request was shorter, fewer words, clinical. It did not argue. It stated it was returned unsigned. After that, the commander stopped asking. In whispered briefings under low light, maps spread across wooden crates slick with condensation, he outlined the crossing as if it were already approved. His tone was calm, almost detached. He described currents, mud depth, and expected resistance along the far embankment. He spoke of timing in minutes, not hours. He never mentioned the denial. Corporal Reyes, who carried the radio set and never missed a word, later said the fear in those meetings wasn't about the enemy. It was about him. Not fear of cruelty, fear of certainty. There was something in his voice that suggested he had already accepted the cost. The river itself was swollen from weeks of rain. It moved like a dark muscle under gray sky, wide and indifferent. Recon patrols had reported machine gun nests dug into the far tree line. The enemy had elevation, sandbagged fortifications, and clear lines of fire. Casualty estimates ran above 30% in the first wave alone. Headquarters calculated risk through ratios. The commander calculated through momentum. If they waited, the enemy would harden the position. If they struck fast, surprise might compensate for exposure. From the opposing bank, a young enemy lieutenant watched the same river and believed it impenetrable. He trusted the current as an ally. He trusted that no sane officer would send men into that water under daylight observation. He was right about the water. He was wrong about the officer. In the command tent, Mehta confronted him quietly. The canvas walls snapped under a sudden gust, lantern flame bending sideways. "Sir, without authorization, this is career ending." It was not an accusation, it was a warning. The commander adjusted a compass on the map and replied without looking up, "Careers are for peacetime." That was the second unsettling thing. He did not frame the crossing as rebellion. He framed it as a necessity. Word spread through the ranks in fragments. Some called him brilliant, citing previous engagements where his timing had outmaneuvered larger forces. Others called him detached, as if he viewed men as movable pieces. Both assessments felt true. He trained them relentlessly for night movement, for silent water entry, for synchronized emergence on unstable ground. He corrected minor errors with surgical precision but never humiliated anyone publicly. Respect grew, so did dread. The night before the crossing, the rain stopped. The silence felt unnatural, as if the jungle itself were holding breath. Soldiers checked rifles in near darkness, fingers slick with humidity. The smell of river silt drifted into camp. Callahan noticed the commander standing alone again, staring toward the black ribbon of water. No speech, no rallying words, just a long look across. Meta lay awake listening to insects grind against canvas and wondered whether this was conviction or arrogance. He could not decide. That uncertainty would haunt him long after. The question lingered in every mind, but no one voiced it aloud. Why would a decorated officer throw away his career and his men on a river-crossing command refused to authorize? Perhaps because he believed delay would kill more than action. Perhaps because he trusted his reading of terrain over distant projections. Or perhaps because somewhere between the second denial and the third silence, he stopped believing the institution could see what he saw. At dawn, when mist clung low over the water and the first boots stepped into the current, the line between hero and rogue operator dissolved into something far more dangerous, and no official record would ever fully explain why. He knew the risks. He knew the command said no. So why did 18 men follow him into the water anyway? By late 1968, the map of the province looked less like terrain and more like a pulse chart. Red grease pencil lines marked confirmed enemy supply routes threading through triple canopy jungle, slipping across borders, vanishing into mountain folds. Interdiction reports stacked up in metal filing trays there. Strikes launched, artillery missions fired, bomb damage assessments filed with cautious optimism, and yet the same red lines kept reappearing, slightly shifted, never severed. Inside a low wooden briefing hut lit by a single swinging bulb, Captain Murray stood over a rain-smudged topographic map, pinned beneath spent shell casings to keep it from curling. Cigarette smoke hung in layers beneath the corrugated tin roof. The monsoon had been falling for 3 days, turning footpaths into mud veins and riverbanks into unstable clay. Across from him, intelligence analyst Harper traced a finger along a blue ribbon cutting across the map. "This bend," he said quietly, tapping once. "Confirmed foot traffic. Repeated. Night movement only. We've got 2 separate sensor hits and 1 visual from aerial recon before the cloud cover rolled in." The river curved there in a slow, deceptive arc, wide enough to discourage casual crossing, shallow enough in one narrow stretch barely 40 meters across to allow a disciplined unit to ford under cover of darkness. It was the only viable crossing point within 12 kilometers that didn't expose a unit to open sandbanks or elevated observation posts. On paper, the solution was obvious. Destroy the crossing with artillery. Saturate the far bank with airstrikes. Deny passage. But the monsoon had rewritten the rules. Cloud ceilings had dropped below safe flight parameters. Air sorties were being scrubbed daily. Artillery accuracy degraded in the rain, forward observers struggling to correct fire through mist and tree canopy. And every day that passed, Harper's intercept logs showed subtle shifts. The enemy was adjusting routes, testing alternatives. Intelligence decays faster than ammunition in this kind of war. Murray listened to the distant rumble of artillery somewhere beyond the hills, a dull percussion softened by rain. It sounded decisive from a distance. It rarely was. Official doctrine favored patience, containment, attrition. The higher command's directive was clear: avoid unnecessary exposure, preserve manpower, wait for conditions to improve. But waiting had its own cost. From the tactical map perspective, the corridor beyond that river bend was more than a line. It was a logistical artery feeding munitions and personnel into 3 contested districts. Cut it, even temporarily, and enemy operations downstream would stutter. Leave it intact, and the same firefights would repeat in villages already exhausted by repetition. Harper adjusted his glasses, pushing them up a nose slick with humidity. "We've got maybe 72 hours before they shift. After that, we're chasing ghosts again." Murray nodded once. He had heard the same tone in different wars, different rooms. The quiet urgency beneath institutional caution. Outside, rain hammered the roof in uneven waves. In the operations tent next door, a radio hissed with intermittent static, voices fading in and out as atmospheric interference swallowed syllables. Every delay felt like erosion. From higher headquarters, the message came back measured and bureaucratic. Negative on cross-border escalation. Negative on independent river crossing without air cover. Reassess in 48 hours. 48 hours might as well have been 48 years in jungle warfare. Down at the platoon level, Sergeant Cole sat with the men under a stretched poncho, cleaning grit from a rifle bolt with a strip of cloth. He didn't see maps. He saw the river when they'd last scouted it, brown, swollen, deceptively calm. He remembered the way the current tugged at his boots near the bank, stronger than it looked. He also remembered the pattern. Every time they waited for ideal conditions, the enemy adapted first. Perspective shifts in war are rarely synchronized. At headquarters, caution feels responsible. On the ground, it feels like paralysis. Murray returned to the map as condensation from the humid air beaded along the paper. The topographic lines were beginning to blur at the edges where rainwater had dripped from his sleeve. He studied elevation gradients on the far bank. A narrow tree line offered concealment within 50 meters of the crossing. Beyond that, a faint rise high enough for overwatch if secured quickly. He ran the numbers in silence. 18 men, night insertion, silent crossing, establish observation, confirm traffic, call for interdiction once proof was undeniable, minimal engagement, maximum disruption. It was a tactical gamble dealt on asymmetry. Strategy demanded broad strokes bombing campaigns, area denial, sweeping operations. Execution at this scale required precision and speed before bureaucracy caught up. Harper looked up. If you go now, you go alone. Murray met his eyes. If we wait, we go nowhere. The room fell quiet except for rain and distant thunder. No dramatic speeches, no defiance for its own sake. Just arithmetic. He knew the risks. River crossings magnify vulnerability. Weapons held above heads. Packs weighing heavier in water. Sound traveling differently across a wet surface. One slip, one snapped branch, and concealment evaporates. He also knew that momentum in this theater belonged to whoever acted before the weather shifted or the intelligence rotted. When he stepped outside, the air felt thicker than before, the jungle breathing steam into the night. The men looked up as he approached, reading posture before words. They had followed him through ambushes, through silent patrols that stretched for days without contact, through moments when hesitation would have meant encirclement. He didn't frame it as defiance of command, he framed it as timing. Windows closing, he said simply. We cross tonight. Cole searched his face for doubt and found none. That was enough. Institutional caution would remain intact in the paperwork. Reports would describe reconnaissance intent. Language would be careful. But in the quiet space between strategy and execution, the decision had already been made. 18 men began checking waterproof seals, tightening straps, wrapping radio components in additional plastic sheeting. Movements are economical. Conversations are minimal. The river was less than 2 kilometers away, hidden behind layers of foliage and shadow. From the tactical map, it was a thin blue line. From the jungle floor, it was a threshold. And as the rain intensified, washing footprints from the path behind them, the gamble was no longer theoretical. 3 men made it back. 15 didn't. But the real question isn't who survived, it's why the command tried to pretend none of them were ever there. At 2100 hours, the river looked less like water and more like absence. No moon, no reflected sky, just a black surface that swallowed depth and distance. Sergeant Hale stood at the tree line on the near bank, watching the current move without sound. He had led insertions before, but this one felt different, not because of the mission brief, which had been thin and confident, but because of what wasn't in it. No secondary extraction point, no updated patrol maps. The enemy presence on the far bank had been assessed as minimal. Minimal was a word that killed men. The point man, Corporal Reyes, stepped into the water first. The cold shocked up through his boots, through his calves, tightening his breath before he forced it quiet. The river smelled of rot and iron. He kept his rifle high across his chest, muzzle angled toward the unseen opposite shore. Behind him, the medic, Larson, adjusted the straps on his aid pack. It was heavier than he admitted. Dry, it was manageable. Soaked, it would drag like an anchor. In 21:15, they moved in staggered formation, black shapes dissolving into black water. The radio man, Collins, kept one hand on the handset sealed in plastic against his chest. He could already feel condensation creeping inside the wrap. Electronics hated humidity. He hated relying on electronics. By 21:30, the shoreline had disappeared behind them. The only reference point was the faint, darker smear of jungle ahead. The current pressed harder than intel suggested, pushing diagonally downstream. Hale felt it immediately. They were compensating too much. Every step forward bled sideways. At 22:12, the water reached chest height. Equipment shifted. Slings dug into shoulders. Every breath had to be measured. Too loud, and the river would carry it. Too fast, and panic would rise. Bioluminescent plankton shimmered faintly around their submerged legs, tiny green sparks igniting with each movement. Beautiful, damning. Reyes froze when he saw it. Each step was a flare in miniature. He looked back. Hale met his eyes and gave the smallest shake of the head. Keep moving. On the far bank, unseen, a pair of North Vietnamese sentries watched the river's surface. They had been told infiltration was possible, but unlikely. The Americans preferred air. The jungle swallowed helicopters poorly, but rivers swallowed men better. One sentry leaned forward, squinting. He thought he saw light flicker against the current. He told himself it was fish. At 22:30, mid-river, the formation drifted further south than planned. Collins tried a low whisper into the handset, requesting minor course correction from the rear element. Static answered. He adjusted the antenna angle, careful not to raise it above the waterline. Static again. He felt the first thread of unease tighten in his stomach. The current strengthened. Boots lost purchase on the riverbed. Hale signaled a lateral shift, but the movement exposed more plankton flashes. For a moment, the water around them glowed faintly, outlining shapes that should have remained invisible. On the bank, one of the sentries stiffened. This time he was certain. He leaned close to his companion and whispered. The whisper traveled along the tree line like a match catching dry grass. At 23:15, Reyes's boots hit mud. The far bank rose steep and tangled with roots. He crouched, listening. The jungle exhaled humidity and the faint snap of something brittle under pressure. Bone-dry branches, not from the river, from weight. He raised a fist. Behind him, men eased forward, water draining from sleeves, from rifle stocks, from the hems of uniforms. The darkness was so complete that Reyes couldn't see his own hands lest they broke the surface of the river. He strained to separate natural jungle noise from something intentional. Then he heard it. A murmur. Vietnamese voices, low and close. Hale felt the shift before the first shot. The jungle's silence had texture. This silence felt held. He motioned left, trying to fan out into partial cover, but the bank was narrow, hemmed by thick vegetation and a steep incline. A single muzzle flash cracked from the tree line. Suppressed but unmistakable, the round struck water, sending a sharp spray across Collins' face. The taste of silt filled his mouth. Contact. Reyes fired toward the flash. The recoil jolted his waterlogged arms. Larson dropped to a knee, scanning for wounded before there were any. The second volley came heavier, unsuppressed now. Muffled gunfire thudded across water and into flesh. One man fell backward into the river without a sound, swallowed instantly by black. Collins keyed the handset. Contact, the far bank. Engaged. Request, static. He hit it again, adjusting frequency. Nothing. The plastic wrap had torn. Moisture crept into circuitry. At 000 hours, communication died completely. On the near bank, the rear element waited for the scheduled check-in. When it didn't come, the lieutenant in charge hesitated. Protocols require patience. Breaking radio silence too early could compromise the mission further. He told himself the team was likely securing a perimeter. On the far bank, Hale understood within seconds that the landing zone had not been unguarded. This was not chance detection. It was an expectation. It was an expectation. The enemy had positioned overlapping fields of fire along likely ascent points they knew where a crossing would occur. Poor intel. Underestimated presence. No extraction plan beyond rally and move inland. Reyes crawled toward a fallen log, bullets snapping overhead. The sound different from training, sharper, more intimate. A round struck the mud inches from his face, spraying grit into his eyes. He blinked through it, heart pounding. Not with panic, but with the cold awareness that they were pinned at the worst possible geography, half in water, half on slope. Larson dragged a wounded private behind a root system, hands already slick with blood diluted by river water. He pressed gauze against the chest wound, whispering, "Stay with me," as if the words themselves could plug the hole. Hale scanned for a maneuver path. There wasn't one. The jungle behind the enemy glowed faintly with disciplined muzzle flashes. They were firing in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition. They had numbers, and they had elevation. The current continued to pull at the men still in water, threatening to separate the formation entirely. One soldier tried to regain footing and slipped, rifle vanishing beneath the surface. Collins tried the radio one last time. He tapped it against his palm, as if impact might dislodge the failure. Silence answered. In that silence, something inside him shifted, not fear. Finality. Across the river, the rear element finally broke protocol and transmitted. Their call drifted unanswered into humid air. At 002, Hale made the decision he would replay for the rest of his life. He ordered a push up the bank. Staying meant slow elimination. Moving meant exposure. He chose exposure. They surged forward into concentrated fire. For a brief, violent moment, distance closed. Reyes reached the first enemy position and fired point-blank into a shadow that became a man. The jungle erupted with shouted commands in Vietnamese. More lights, more guns. Then a flare arced overhead, bathing the river in white glare. Every shape was revealed. Men in water, men in mud, blood mixing with current. The plankton ignited again, sparkling around bodies thrashing in panic. It became unsalvageable right there. Not when the first shot was fired, not when the radio died, but when the flare exposed them and there was nowhere left to disappear. Hale saw it in a single glance. Too many enemy positions, too little cover. Men already down with no medevac possible. He understood that even if 3 or 4 broke through, the majority would not. The river that had concealed them now trapped them. The jungle that promised cover became a wall. Reyes was hit mid-stride, spinning into darkness. Larson kept working until a round struck his shoulder, spinning him sideways into the mud beside the man he was trying to save. Collins felt heat tear through his side and collapsed backward into waist-deep water, the handset rifting from his grip. By 0101, the gunfire tapered. The river resumed its indifferent movement. On the near bank, faint echoes reached the waiting element. They could not tell if it was thunder or distant engagement. Orders from higher command instructed them to hold position and avoid escalation. 3 men, disoriented and half-submerged downstream, would eventually crawl back through reeds and mud to friendly lines at dawn. 15 would not, and in the weeks that followed, the paperwork would be adjusted, language softened, presence denied. But the river remembered, the darkness remembered, and the men who survived would carry the hour-by-hour collapse long after command chose silence. For 72 hours after the river swallowed the last radio transmission, nothing officially happened. No rescue helicopters crossed back over the tree line. No artillery illuminated the banks where the bodies had fallen. The grid coordinates that had burned so brightly on tactical maps were quietly cleared from the operations board, replaced with routine training markers. Inside the forward command post, the fluorescent lights hummed with a steady, indifferent buzz, casting everything in a flat, antiseptic glow. Captain Elias Rowan sat on a metal chair outside the debrief room, boots still crusted with dried mud from the crossing that technically had never occurred. His right sleeve was cut open where a medic had stitched him in the field. Across from him, Sergeant Mateo Ibarra stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. The third survivor, Corporal Dean Whitaker, lay 2 floors below in a military hospital ward, sedated, separated from the others, for observation. They were told they were lucky. Inside the debrief room, the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and toner ink. A digital recorder sat in the center of the table, its red light blinking. The questions were precise, controlled, almost rehearsed. "You were conducting a routine reconnaissance exercise." "Yes, sir." "There was no cross-border incursion." "No, sir." "You encountered unexpected environmental hazards." Rowan hesitated just long enough to feel the temperature in the room drop. Then he answered, "Yes, sir." No mention of the firefight. No mention of the request for extraction that never came. No mention of the men who had been pinned against the embankment while higher command debated authorization thresholds. To acknowledge the crossing would mean admitting the operation had been launched without final clearance. It would mean court-martials for ambitious colonels, congressional hearings during an election year already balanced on a knife's edge. It would mean reporters asking why a reconnaissance unit had been sent into hostile territory without air cover. And so the calculus was made. By the second day, casualty forms were drafted with alternative language. Training accident, navigation error, missing in action during scheduled exercise. The location field was left blank. In suburban living rooms thousands of miles away, uniformed notification officers stood on welcome mats and cleared their throats. The script was delivered in steady tones. There had been an incident during a routine training evolution. Details were still under review. The Department of Defense extended its deepest sympathies. In Ohio, Private First Class Nolan Reyes's mother kept nodding as if clarity might arrive if she agreed with every word. Her living room smelled of lemon polish and last night's coffee. The television flickered silently in the background. She asked where it happened. The officers exchanged a glance and repeated that the matter was under investigation. When they left, the house felt cavernous, as though sound itself had retreated. In Texas, Whitaker's younger sister searched online for news of any accident matching the description. She found nothing. No training mishap, no helicopter crash, no public statement, just silence. Back at the base hospital, Corporal Whitaker woke in the middle of the night to the hiss of oxygen and the rhythmic beep of monitors. A guard sat outside his door, not for protection, he realized, for containment. When Rowan was finally allowed to see him, their conversation lasted 4 minutes before a legal officer intervened. "You are not to discuss operational specifics with anyone," the officer said, voice smooth as polished stone. "This is for national security. National security." The phrase hung in the air like a disinfectant, masking the smell without removing the rot. Sergeant Ibarra signed a document acknowledging the non-disclosure agreement. The paper was crisp, the header stamped in red, classified. His hand trembled only once when he reached the line affirming that any disclosure could result in imprisonment. He had lost 9 men in 12 minutes on that riverbank. Now he was being told the greater threat was his memory. Within a week, the 3 survivors were reassigned. Rowan to a logistics unit in another state, Ibarra to a training command far from operational theaters. Whitaker was discharged on medical grounds, his file sealed. They were scattered like debris after an explosion, separated before they could compare notes, before anger could coalesce into accusation. Years later, declassified memos would surface thin sheets of yellowing paper retrieved from archival boxes labeled with innocuous dates. One memo, authored 48 hours after the incident, read, "Formal acknowledgement of cross-border engagement would necessitate review of command authorization protocols. Recommend classification under training exercise anomaly to mitigate institutional exposure." The language was clinical, almost elegant in its detachment. Mitigate institutional exposure, not honor the dead, not inform the families. Mitigate exposure. An investigative journalist named Lena Park found the memo buried in a batch of partially redacted files released under a transparency initiative decades later. She had been chasing rumors of an unauthorized operation for months, piecing together fragments from veterans' forums and forgotten court transcripts. When she held the memo under her desk lamp, the light caught the indentation of a signature pressed hard into the page. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. Park tracked down Rowan first. He lived quietly, working a civilian job, the past folded into the tight lines around his eyes. At first he refused to speak. Then she showed him the memo, the official phrasing, the deliberate erasure. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He simply said, "They told us the mission failed, but it didn't fail. It was denied." That was the pivot. The tragedy had not ended at the river. It had metastasized in conference rooms and filing cabinets. The men had not only been lost, they had administratively disappeared. When Park's story finally published, families read for the first time the coordinates of where their sons had died. They saw the words "unauthorized incursion" and understood why no rescue had come. Some felt vindicated. Others felt a second wave of grief, sharper than the first. Because betrayal cuts differently than loss. In the sterile glow of those command offices years earlier, the decision had been framed as necessary, strategic, temporary. But silence has weight. It settles into bones. It follows survivors into sleep. If the mission was erased, how did the story survive? And who finally forced the truth into light? The answer lies not just in documents or journalism, but in the refusal of memory to comply with official narratives, in the quiet persistence of those who were told to forget. And that refusal would soon confront the very institution that believed it could outlast the truth. He gave the dead their names back. But what did it cost him to carry 15 ghosts for 40 years? His name was Daniel Collins, the radioman who watched his handset go silent at midnight and understood, before anyone said it aloud, that they were alone. He was 22 when he crawled out of the reeds downstream, half-conscious river silt caked in his mouth and ears. He was 62 when he opened the last of the file boxes in his basement and realized he had spent more than half his life trying to finish a mission that never officially happened. In the years after the crossing, the silence from command hardened into something institutional. Reports were shortened, coordinates blurred, the word engagement replaced specifics. 15 men reduced to abstractions. Collins kept waiting for the correction, for the acknowledgement that would align the record with memory. It never came, so he started writing. He had kept his original field notebook, the pages warped from water damage, ink bled into faint blue shadows. He would take it out at night after his family had gone to sleep. The basement smelled of dust and old cardboard. A single overhead bulb cast a yellow cone of light over a folding table. His hands, calloused and slightly trembling even decades later, would trace the indented lines where he had pressed too hard in the dark. 2230, current stronger than brief. 2315, voices on the bank, not random. E0 on, radio dead. He wrote in fragments because that was how memory returned, never as a full story, always as pieces. His wife Mary Ann remembered the early years. He didn't talk about it, she would say later, but he wasn't here either. He startled at small sounds. He avoided rivers. On humid nights, he would sit upright in bed, breath shallow, as if listening for something only he could hear. The VA called it post-traumatic stress. Collins called it unfinished. He began tracking down families. It started with a name etched into a local memorial, one of the 15. He drove 3 hours to knock on a stranger's door. In his hand, he carried a photocopy of a blurred after-action map and a photograph taken weeks before the crossing men, smiling, unaware of how close the darkness already was. "I was there," he told the mother who opened the door. "I need you to know he didn't disappear." He brought a small tape recorder to those meetings. You can hear the click before each interview begins, the whir of the cassette turning, his voice, steady but low, asking permission to remember out loud. Over the decades, his basement filled with file boxes, handwritten letters from siblings, copies of service records, photographs of the dead laid carefully across a long table, each labeled in black ink. He built a dossier not out of obsession alone, but out of defiance. If the institution would not hold the memory, he would. There were costs. His son once asked why he spent so much time with men who aren't here. Collins didn't have an answer that satisfied a teenager. Family vacations were cut short for cemetery visits. Anniversaries of the crossing turned him inward and unreachable. Mary Ann described it as living with a man who shared their house with 15 invisible guests, and yet he never framed it as a burden. "They didn't get to grow old," he said in one recorded fragment. "The least I can do is grow old, remembering." In 2008, after 4 decades of collecting fragments, Collins mailed a thick envelope to a military historian known for reopening overlooked operations. Inside were photocopies of his field notes, annotated maps, transcripts of interviews, and a personal letter that began simply, "This happened. I was there. They deserve to be counted." The historian, Dr. Everett Hale, was cautious by training. Archives are filled with claims, but as he read through the material, something shifted. The timestamps aligned. The coordinates matched satellite imagery declassified years later. The casualty lists corresponded to men listed as training accident or lost during maneuver. Patterns emerged that were too precise to dismiss. Hale visited Collins in person. He remembered the basement vividly. "The air is cool and dry. boxes stacked with almost military symmetry. Collins' hands resting on a worn notebook, fingertips yellowed slightly by age. "You've done the work," Hale told him quietly. "You kept the chain intact." The declassification process was slow, bureaucratic, and resistant. Files had to be requested, reviewed, cross-referenced. Some pages were still redacted beyond usefulness. But the weight of Collins' archive made erasure harder to sustain. In 2011, a partial declassification was approved. The crossing re-entered official history in a brief, understated memorandum. No ceremony, no apology, just acknowledgement. For Collins, it was enough. He stood at a cemetery that autumn, 15 small American flags marking names that were no longer footnotes. The wind moved gently through the grass. He read each name aloud, not as a roll call for the fallen, but as proof of existence. He had not saved them. That truth never softened, but he had refused to let them dissolve into silence. In his later interviews, his voice carried less edge. "I thought I survived," he said once, pausing as if testing the word. "Turns out I was assigned. Assigned to remember. Assigned to assemble. Assigned to stand where the institution stepped back." Memory became his counteroffensive. The river had swallowed 15 men. The paperwork had tried to swallow the event. But a basement archive, built by aging hands and stubborn conscience, pushed the crossing back into light. He gave the dead their names back, and in doing so, he transformed from survivor into witness, from haunted into guardian. The ghosts never fully left him, but they were no longer voiceless. There is a difference between what is classified and what is buried. Classification can be temporary, a lock placed on information until risk subsides. Burial is something else. Burial is narrative management. It is the quiet reshaping of memory so that institutions remain intact, even if the truth does not. Years after Lena Park's article forced fragments of the crossing into public view, the river remained unchanged. It moved the same way it always had, broad, patient, indifferent to uniforms or flags. At dawn, mist rose from its surface in slow ribbons, softening the edges of the opposite bank where the first shots had cracked through humid air. A narrow trail now leads toward the approximate crossing point. The jungle has reclaimed most of the terrain. Roots twist through what was once a staging area. The earth has absorbed the trenches, the boot prints, the brief violence. Only those who know where to look can align the present landscape with the satellite images from decades ago. In 2014, after persistent lobbying by families and veterans, a small memorial plaque was installed several hundred yards from the water. It is modest, bronze mounted on a stone base no higher than the knee, no dramatic inscription, no detailed account, just names, 11 of them. Beneath, a single line, "In honor of those lost during a training exercise, year redacted." The phrasing remains technically consistent with the original report. Captain Rowan visited once. He stood before the plaque in civilian clothes, hands clasped behind his back, posture unconsciously reverting to attention. The metal was cool under his fingers. Rain had left faint mineral streaks across the names, as if the river itself had tried to reclaim them. He did not speak. He simply counted, 1 through 11, lips moving slightly. "Sergeant Ibarra has not returned. He says he does not need the plaque. The river is enough." The question that lingers is not only whether the crossing was tactically sound or recklessly conceived. Military history is filled with operations that are balanced on the edge between necessity and ambition. Some succeeded and were celebrated. Others failed and were dissected in war colleges for generations. Strategy is always clearer in hindsight. But what happens when hindsight is denied? The debate over the crossing's wisdom is almost secondary to the fact that the men who died were initially removed from the record. An operation can be flawed. A commander can miscalculate. War is not a laboratory. Yet erasing sacrifice introduces a different moral calculus, one that moves beyond tactics into the realm of institutional survival. Some operations remain classified because disclosure would compromise methods or alliances. That logic has precedent. But when documents reveal deliberate language designed to mitigate institutional exposure, the purpose shifts. The focus turns inward. Preservation of authority eclipses preservation of memory. Standing by the river today, you hear only water and birds. The current moves steadily around submerged stones, indifferent to borders once crossed in secrecy. Light filters through the canopy, breaking into fragments on the surface. The air carries the scent of damp soil and vegetation reclaiming abandoned ground. It is difficult in that quiet to imagine the chaos that once fractured the morning. The shouted commands, the metallic snap of gunfire, the concussive thud of grenades landing too close, the split-second decisions that determined who reached the far bank and who did not. History often remembers the victories that fit clean narratives. It engraves them in textbooks and monuments, but it is less comfortable with ambiguity, with missions that hover between courage and misjudgment, with chains of command that protected themselves first. The plaque receives few visitors, a handful each year, a parent on an anniversary, a journalist retracing a story, occasionally a young officer who has heard whispers of the crossing and wants to see where it happened. Most pass by unaware that anything occurred there at all, and that may be the final tension. Memory is not automatic. It requires intention. It requires someone to refuse the convenience of silence. How many other crossings were erased? How many names are still missing from plaques that do not yet exist? And who decides what history remembers? The river offers no answers. It continues its slow, unbroken movement toward a distant sea, carrying silt, leaves, and the faint reflections of those who stand on its banks searching for meaning. In the end, institutions endure by adapting their stories. Landscapes endure by outlasting them. The truth, when it surfaces, does so quietly, etched into bronze, whispered in interviews, carried by those who refuse to let memory dissolve. The water keeps flowing. The jungle keeps growing, and somewhere beneath the surface, the current still moves across a line that, officially, was never crossed.